The logging company showed up on a Wednesday with a truck and a chainsaw and a piece of paper. Danny Thibodaux was sitting on the porch of his great-grandmother's property when they came down the access road. Two men in the truck, a third driving a flatbed with equipment on it. They stopped at the edge of the cypress stand along the south boundary and got out and started walking the tree line with a clipboard. Danny came down off the porch. His Malinois Roux came with him. The man with the clipboard introduced himself as a representative of Thibodaux Timber Group. He said the company held timber rights to the cypress stand on the south end of the property, granted in a 1987 agreement with the previous owner. He said the rights had never been exercised, and the company intended to begin harvesting before the end of the month. Danny asked to see the agreement. The man showed him a copy, a one-page document dated 1987, granting Thibodaux Timber Group the right to harvest cypress timber from the south boundary of the property in perpetuity, signed by a woman named Celestine Arsenault. Celestine Arsenault was Danny's great-grandmother. She had died in February at 94. The property was 14 acres of Louisiana bayou land outside of Breaux Bridge, mostly cypress and water oak, with a raised Creole cottage at the north end that had been in the family since 1923. Danny said he needed time to look into the agreement before any harvesting began. The timber company representative said the rights were clear and documented, and the company intended to proceed on schedule. Roux stood beside Danny and said nothing. She did not need to. Danny said he would be in touch and went back inside. He had come down from Baton Rouge 3 weeks earlier when the estate was settled. He had not expected to stay. He had a job in Baton Rouge, a drafting position with an engineering firm, and he had planned to spend a week or two sorting through Celestine's things and then figure out what to do with the property from a distance. But 3 weeks in, he was still there, and the drafting job had become something he thought about less each day, and the property had become something he thought about more. Celestine had lived on those 14 acres for 71 years. She had raised 4 children there, outlived 2 husbands, grown a kitchen garden that ran along the east side of the cottage, and maintained the cypress stand with the specific attention of a woman who understood that old trees on wet land were not just trees, but the thing that held everything else in place. She had told Danny once, when he was 12, that the cypress stand was the oldest part of the property, that the trees along the south boundary were 200 years old if they were a day, and that nobody with sense would ever cut them. He had been thinking about that conversation since the timber company left. Roux had been working the property since the first morning. She was 3 years old, former protection sport dog, and she applied the same systematic energy to exploring the bayou land that she applied to everything, which was complete and undivided. She ran the perimeter, checked the water line where the property met the bayou, worked the cypress stand twice a day. On the 4th day after the timber company visit, she stopped under a specific cypress tree at the south boundary and began to dig. Danny noticed because Roux did not dig. In 3 years, he had never seen her dig at anything. She tracked, and she indicated, and she retrieved, but she did not dig. It was not in her working repertoire. He walked down to the south boundary. She had cleared about 6 inches of soft bayou soil under the cypress when he got there. She was working steadily, not frantically, with the focus she gave to problems she had decided to solve. Danny crouched beside her and looked into the hole. He could see the top of something, glass, the curved shoulder of a mason jar sealed with a zinc lid, the kind used for canning before rubber-sealed lids became standard. He helped her finish. The jar was intact. The seal had held against the moisture of the bayou soil, which in that part of Louisiana was a minor miracle, or possibly not a miracle, but a deliberate choice by someone who knew the land and knew what sealed glass could survive in it. Inside the jar, rolled tight and held with a strip of cloth, were two documents. The first was a deed restriction, typed on letterhead from a Breaux Bridge law office, dated 1951. It described the south boundary of the property in legal terms and stated that the cypress timber on that boundary was restricted from commercial harvest in perpetuity, attached to the property deed, and binding on all subsequent owners and any parties claiming rights derived from the property. 1951, 36 years before the 1987 Timber Rights Agreement, a deed restriction predating a timber rights agreement by 36 years and explicitly prohibiting commercial harvest superseded the later agreement. The timber company could not exercise rights that the property deed had already foreclosed decades before the agreement was signed. The second document was a letter. Celestine's handwriting, in French, dated 2019. Danny's French was workable but not strong, and he sat under the cypress tree for a long time working through it. She had known about the 1987 agreement. One of her sons, Danny's great-uncle, had signed it without her knowledge or authorization in 1987 when she was briefly in the hospital, and he had believed, incorrectly, that he had authority over the property. She had discovered it when she returned and had consulted an attorney who told her the deed restriction made the agreement unenforceable, but that she would need to produce the restriction document to defeat any claim. She had looked for the restriction document for years. The original deed paperwork had been lost in a flood in 1993 that took most of the cottage's stored documents. She had contacted the Breaux Bridge law office, whose letterhead was on the restriction, and been told their records from that period no longer existed. She had eventually accepted that the document was gone, and that the restriction, while real, could not be proven. She had written in the letter that she was putting this in the ground because she did not know what else to do with what she knew. She had written that she had found the document in 2019, tucked inside the cover of a Bible she had not opened in 30 years, and that she had understood immediately that the ground under the cypress tree was the only place she trusted to keep it safe until someone who needed it could find it. She had written, "I do not know who will find this or when. I know the tree will still be standing." Danny folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket and looked up at the cypress above him. 200 years old, the bark gray and furrowed, the knees rising from the wet soil around the base, the canopy spreading wide over the south boundary. Celestine had been right about the tree. Roux sat beside him and looked at the jar in his hands. Danny drove to Lafayette the following morning and found a property attorney named Marcus Webb, who had a practice near the university and a specialty in Louisiana land and timber law that his receptionist described with some emphasis when Danny explained why he was calling. Marcus read the deed restriction twice. Then he read Boudreaux Timber Group's 1987 agreement. Then he set both documents down and looked at Danny. He said, "A properly recorded deed restriction in Louisiana runs with the land. It is binding on every subsequent owner and on every party claiming rights derived from ownership. A timber rights agreement signed in 1987 by someone without ownership authority cannot grant rights that the deed restriction had already foreclosed in 1951. Danny asked if the restriction needed to be on record somewhere to be enforceable. Marcus said the original recording would have been at the parish clerk's office in 1951. He said those records from that period were incomplete due to flood damage over the decades, but that the physical document itself, if authentic, carried significant evidentiary weight. He said he would have the document examined and would pull whatever parish records existed from 1951 to corroborate it. The parish records were partial but present. A ledger entry from November 1951 referenced a deed restriction filing for the Arsenault property on the South Bayou boundary. No copy of the document survived in the parish records, but the ledger entry confirmed a filing had occurred. Marcus sent a formal letter to Boudreaux Timber Group the following week, attaching the deed restriction document, the ledger entry from the parish records, and a legal opinion stating that the 1987 Timber Rights Agreement was unenforceable against the terms of the 1951 restriction. Boudreaux Timber Group did not respond for 3 weeks. When they did, their attorney acknowledged the deed restriction and stated the company was withdrawing its harvest plan pending internal review. A second letter 2 weeks later confirmed the withdrawal was permanent and that the company was relinquishing its claim to the timber rights. Danny framed that letter and put it on the wall of the cottage beside a photograph of Celestine that he found in a box in the back bedroom. She was standing in front of the cypress stand in the photograph, young, maybe 30, looking directly at the camera with the expression of a woman who was not in the habit of looking away from things. He called his mother in Baton Rouge and told her what had happened. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Ma mère always said those trees would outlast anyone who tried to take them." Danny said she had been right. His mother asked if he was coming back to Baton Rouge. Danny looked out the window at the cypress stand along the south boundary. The afternoon light came through the canopy in long, broken pieces across the bayou water. Roux was down at the tree line, working the edge of the water the way she worked it every afternoon, thorough and unhurried. He said he was not sure yet. He was sure. He just was not ready to say it out loud. He stayed. He gave notice at the drafting job in October and spent the fall learning the property the way Celestine had known it, which was from the ground up and without shortcuts. He cleared the kitchen garden and replanted it from seed packets he found in the cottage, some of them in Celestine's handwriting on the envelopes. He repaired the porch boards and replaced the screen door and repointed the chimney where the mortar had cracked. He found a pirogue in the equipment shed under a tarp, a flat-bottomed canoe Celestine had used to move through the bayou, and spent several weekends learning to pole it through the shallow water along the south boundary, learning the waterways the way she had known them. Roux rode in the bow. She was not a dog built for boats, but she adapted with the pragmatism that Malinois apply to new problems, which is to assess, adjust, and proceed. She stood in the bow, with her nose reading the bayou air, and her weight shifting automatically with the movement of the hull. She had found the jar on the 4th day of digging at nothing in her life, before or since. Whatever had drawn her to that specific tree and that specific patch of soil had done its work and departed. The cypress stand stayed. In spring, the knees pushed up through the new growth around the base of the old trees, and the canopy filled in, and the south boundary of the property looked the way it had looked for 200 years, which was permanent and unhurried and completely unimpressed by anyone's paperwork. Danny went down to the big tree most mornings, not for any specific reason, just to look at it and remember what was buried there and what it had taken to keep those trees standing. Celestine had known. She had written, "I know the tree will still be standing." She had been right about that, too. Every story on this channel starts the same way: a veteran and his dog, and something the dog knew before the man did. New story next week. Subscribe if you want to be here when it drops.